All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Before we begin, I would like to remind everyone to please stay muted and that this presentation will be recorded. Any questions that you have throughout the webinar can be sent in the chat, and I will relay them to our guest. I want to thank everyone for joining us today, especially our guest speaker, Kevin Chu. Kevin is the Executive Director of Vermont's Future Project and has been with them for a couple of years now. He is a lifelong Vermonter and graduate of Middlebury College, who loves to explore every part of their great state and on his bike. Kevin, I will open the floor for you to start us off and give us a further introduction and kind of tell us a little bit about what the Vermont Future Project is.
Great, Danielle. Thank you so much for having me. I'll begin with an introduction of who I am and then talk a little bit about the Futures Project before we dive into some questions. So as Danielle mentioned, I am a Vermonter. I like to say I was born in Vermont. I grew up here and I look forward to growing old here too. And I truly mean that. And that does shape how I see the work that I'm doing, thinking about Vermont's future and being able to build a future that I want to live in and be happy in. So I ended up in Vermont as the son of immigrant parents. My parents came to Vermont from Southeast China in 1986. And the reason why I have an aunt who married an American, and they had a home in Shelburne, Vermont at the time. And that's how I ended up here, just sort of random chance. I think back to the brave decision that my parents made to leave their home community. Neither of them had a college degree. Neither of them spoke English. They had very little money in their pockets when they left the country to come to the U.S., but they came to the U.S. in pursuit of the American dream, economic opportunity. They grew up in a rural agricultural community, and at the time they moved, my older brother was 3 at the time, and they wanted the opportunity to build a better life for themselves and for their kids. So I share that because, again, with the work of the Futures Project and thinking about Vermont's future, especially the economy, I want to make sure that Vermont continues to be a place that people see as a place of opportunity, regardless of where they come from, what background they have. And I'll shift over now to talking a little bit about the Vermont Futures Project. So we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization, data informed. We do research and education to support Vermont's economic future. And we actually have a mission question that we pursue. So instead of a mission statement, our work is trying to answer this question: how can we use data to support the evolution of Vermont's economy towards a thriving future with opportunity for all? The Futures Project has been around for about 7 years now in an official capacity, and the big win so far that most people know the Futures Project for is the development of a data dashboard. So over 100 different metrics that are giving insights into the health of Vermont's economy through various perspectives. And then off of those metrics, we've developed some white papers, research papers, blog articles to take what we're seeing in the data and carry out the education part of our mission. So that's what we've been doing. Now in this current phase of the Vermont Futures Project, looking forward, we're really leaning into the proactive approach to education. A data dashboard's a passive tool, right? Users need to access it to find the resources that they need, but we're really thinking, how do we get the right information to the right people at the right time so that policy decisions and conversations that are happening around Vermont with regards to our economic future are informed by data. And what that will look like is the development of a statewide economic vision. And I am very upfront in saying I'm not smart enough to write the whole thing on my own, nor am I stupid enough to try. So I'm always looking for people to collaborate with. And we envision this being about a 1.5-year process in which we source goals and strategies from regional plans to elevate up to the statewide level. Then we'll put metrics behind that and then engage in community conversations to understand what are the actions or the operational pieces of the plan that are needed for the state to hit certain targets. So that's the brief overview of the Vermont Futures Project, past, present, and future.
Wow, it's incredible. And it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of hard work, even just in the few years you've been with them and the 7 years that they've been going and continue to grow. And I really like your vision for moving forward. One of the questions that came to my mind is, can you speak to your affiliation with the chambers? I know you mentioned you were a little bit connected with them.
Yes. So the Vermont Futures Project is affiliated with the Vermont Chamber of Commerce. The Vermont Chamber, they are a policy-driven team. They advocate on behalf of the business community in the state of Vermont to create conditions for economic growth. So their team are in the State House, on the ground, every day, sort of fighting that fight. And when they're caught up in the day-to-day of influencing policy, it's hard to take a step back and really think on a long-term timeline. So they created the Futures Project, which is the Chamber Foundation organization, in order to have a branch of the enterprise that's dedicated to this long-term planning and to then be able to take the data and research to inform how they go about their policy work. The idea of data-informed policy shouldn't be a crazy one, but it doesn't happen often enough either.
Absolutely. Thank you. That's really interesting how you guys collaborate, and they're the people in front of the people, and you guys are kind of behind the scenes doing that data and making sure they're conveying the right message. Speaking of the data, where do you pull all your data points from? Is it things you find on your own, or are you pulling from other sources to get that data dashboard?
Yeah, we are mostly a data aggregator. So we pull most of our data from federal sources, such as the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Labor Statistics. We do also have some local or state level data that we pull into our dashboard, such as from the Vermont Department of Labor. So it's from a variety of sources at a variety of scales, because the story of Vermont's economy happens at multiple scales too. If we only ever published statewide numbers, then we would lose some of the details. But if we if we only had the local numbers, then it wouldn't show the big picture. So we try to have a mix of different types of data, and again, through different perspectives as well. The way that it's organized on our website, we have 6 pillars that we had developed many years ago before I joined. So thinking about metrics through the lens of infrastructure or workforce and talent or innovation and entrepreneurship. To answer your question, it's multiple sources, but it's done intentionally.
Excellent. Yeah, that sounds like you're able to gather the most data that way, pulling from multiple sources rather than just one. What are you seeing in the data for how to retain and attract more workers? Can you talk a little bit about, the workforce?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question that everyone wants to know the answer to right now. It seems like workforce is not only a hot topic in Vermont, but really nationwide.
Absolutely.
And certainly the pandemic had a big influence on labor force participation. And what we've seen in Vermont is a drop in labor force participation that hasn't rebounded. So there's speculation that a lot of that may be due to retirements. Vermont's population, our age demographic, we are the second oldest state in the country. So when COVID hit, there were probably a lot of folks that thought, do I even want to go back to work? And that has had an influence on our labor force participation rates. But there are also other factors at play too. People talk about what are the barriers to work. Things like childcare comes up as a topic. Things like health and safety, right? We had the pandemic, COVID's still around. Even if we're moving more into an endemic phase, it's changed the nature of how safe people feel. And then obviously the rise of remote work has had an influence on the employer-employee dynamics. So there are a lot of factors, and again, it comes down to like an individual level, how a single person feels safe or willing and able to participate in the labor force. And employers need to be aware of what are all those factors that could set someone up for success to be able to participate successfully. And I think that dynamic has shifted. So in terms of what we've seen is Vermont's population has actually gone up a little bit in really the past decade. If you look at the 2010 census compared to the 2020 census, Vermont's population went up by about 17,000. But if you layer on top of that the demographic information, the age profile, even though we have more people, fewer are participating in the workforce because we have an aging population.
Very interesting. Yeah, it sounds like to kind of attract someone to your business, you need to have those things like benefits offered for childcare and different things like that to kind of really keep your workers with you.
Yeah, it's best to take a holistic view, right? And the strategy that works for one person in your company might not work for another. I'll share a really interesting example I heard from a business leader here in Vermont. They were talking about the benefits that they can provide in a very sort of culturally aware way. They have a diverse workforce, and some of their employees celebrate holidays that are part of different cultural calendars, and making space for those employees to be able to participate in ceremonies and rituals that are affiliated with their culture. At the same time, they also have a set of workers who are part of multiple generational Vermont families that have been here for many, many years, and they really enjoy hunting. So the company helped to cover hunting and fishing licenses as a benefit to employees as well, which is in the grand scheme of things a relatively small cost, but those employees felt seen and heard and valued. So that was just a really interesting and unique strategy that has stood out to me in the conversations that I've had with business leaders.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think especially coming through COVID, a lot of businesses are kind of reevaluating what the workday means, how to benefit your employees. It's not always a pay raise, but just appreciating them in that way, like with fishing license and making sure everybody participates in their holidays. BBB, we actually moved to a 4-day work week, which just gives us a lot more time to be at home and has really been excellent for us. So people are really taking a different view to it. And I think that's a great way to kind of attract people. Are you seeing more new businesses pop up coming through the pandemic, like more people that started small businesses or more businesses coming to Vermont?
The data would seem to indicate that if we look at new business creation in the past couple of years, it's gone up. Vermont's always done pretty well in terms of supporting the creation of business, small business. We seem to embrace small business as part of the Vermont identity. I think really for Vermont to move forward successfully and have a thriving economy, we also need to look at the supports for businesses that are small to then scale to become medium sized. So yes, so we have seen an increase in small businesses, but at the same time, we also need to think about business success across the entire spectrum of business size.
Yeah, that's the business success is what's going to keep those small businesses going. Do you have recommendations for businesses staying successful in Vermont, utilizing resources, different things like that?
There are so many different resources available, again, for small business and business creation, both from sort of a resource side, capital, and also from expertise and mentorship. I think that I mentioned that scaling up of business and how small business is sort of part of the Vermont identity. I think what we could do as businesses in the state is create the community connections at an early stage so that when businesses scale, they still feel like an embedded part of the community. And I think that being able to maintain that connection, those human relationships as a company grows is vital to having outside support from the community for the growth of your business.
Absolutely. Yeah, we see that a lot, especially with the Better Business Bureau. We have a lot of resources, and people just don't really know where to turn if they don't have that outside community group, if they're not connected with the local chamber and SBA, something like that to kind of give them that added support. It's hard for them to understand where to turn, what the resources are, what grants they can file for, anything like that. So just having that community collaboration is a great way to kind of continue on that business.
Mm-hmm.
Would you talk a little bit about the data points highlighting entrepreneurship? I know we talked a little bit about the small businesses coming up. Are you seeing more small businesses started from Vermonters or from people coming from outside the state into Vermont?
I'm not quite sure what that split is, and that'd be some interesting data to look into. But I know there has been a rise in the number of businesses that have established a presence in Vermont because of remote work.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as the years go by, it'll be interesting to dive into this data. There's always a bit of a lag in terms of data, and this can be one of the frustrating things, right? We measure things that have happened, and then we try to glean some insights to then project into the future, but I am not in the business of predicting what the future is. And I know there has been an increase of businesses establishing a presence in Vermont. What does that mean long term? Are folks going to permanently stay in Vermont and continue working remotely for businesses outside of the state? If so, that should inform how we create policy on a state level. But maybe this is a temporary phase for some families where they came to Vermont at the height of the pandemic because of how well our community responded to the pandemic. But maybe after a few years, they don't feel a connection to the state and they move back to where they came from. Personally, I would love to see strategies put in place both at the state level and local level to find out who the new Vermonters are, make them feel welcome, and give them a reason to stay. So I mentioned earlier that our population has grown. If you look at the census data from 2010 to 2020, I would argue it hasn't grown enough. And if there's even a chance that some of that growth was just due to a temporary blip from COVID, then we are going to be in a tough spot when it comes to our workforce when we look at the 2030 census. Over the next, let's say 7 years, we will see about 100,000 Vermonters reach retirement age. So I mentioned, our demographic profile. We're the second oldest state in the country. That's what it means in terms of our workforce. We only have about 645,000 people total, and about a sixth of that total population will reach retirement age over the next 7 years.
Wow, that's going to be quite a hit. Do you see a lot more children coming in, younger populations that are going to be ready to fill that gap? College students, anything like that, or is it just?
Yes to college students. So Vermont does a really good job importing young talent through our higher education institutions. For example, the University of Vermont, about 70% of their undergrad population comes from out of state. And that's also due to the fact that we have a really small number of children in state. It's not that UVM favors out of state versus in state. It's just that the number of in-state students hasn't really gone up. So the ratio changes, even though the absolute number hasn't changed much. We need to do a better job in terms of attracting young talent to the state, young professionals across all different job types too. So Vermont needs to be a viable place, regardless of whether you're in professional services, construction, working in the medical field, or any of the above. Interestingly, so Vermont, in terms of pay equity, does really well on a national level. If you look at the median wages for jobs that require less than a college degree, Vermont pays above median wages. Whereas if you look at jobs that require a bachelor's degree or higher, wages are generally lower than the US average. So in terms of pay equity, we're doing really well. However, the affordability piece of that, right? The one piece of the puzzle is how much can people make? And then the other piece is how much can they afford based on what they make. And we have to create the conditions such that Vermont is viable regardless of one lands on the socioeconomic spectrum.
Absolutely. Yeah, that is the game changer. You can make the money, but can you afford to be there and live there? You said
Can
that.
I share one more
Absolutely.
piece of data? So you were asking about the sort of backfilling of those retirements and the balance of the population with younger people. So the number of students enrolled in our K-12 system, I think that's sort of a good indicator of what a future workforce might look like in a state. We've declined quite a bit. So in the past 20 years, Vermont's K-12 enrollment has gone from about 100,000 down to about 80,000. Right. And this year, the 12th grade class in Vermont is only about 5,300 students.
Wow.
Now, just to put that number into perspective and some context, right now there are about 23,000 open jobs in the state of Vermont. And if you look at our unemployment rate, it's in the mid twos. There are about 8,000 unemployed people actively seeking work. So if we take that 23,000 open jobs and let's say all 8,000 people looking for jobs find a job, we'd still have 15,000 open jobs. Now, let's also say all of the 12th graders in the state are going to stay in Vermont and join the workforce. Well, we'd still have about 10,000 open jobs, even if we added all the 12th graders. So that's a way of saying we do need more people. The numbers just don't add up to fill that gap in terms of the workforce need. So that's why I really emphasize, how do we create the conditions for people to be able to come here and make it viable? How do we keep the people that have already chosen to come here, such as folks who may have come during COVID? And then the retention piece of college students. If we look at the demographic data, there's actually a spike in the 18 to 24 age range because the census data includes college students, but we also see a sharp decline after they graduate. But it means they're here, and these are people that have raised their hand and said they are interested in Vermont. They chose to come here for their education, and perhaps there's a pathway for them to stay too.
Absolutely. Do you see what needs to be done specifically to get the college students to stay? I know you said it kind of drops off, but can you talk a little bit more about that? And then talk a little bit more about, do you know why so little kids are in the state now that it's dropped so drastically?
Yep. So I'll start with the college piece. I think that there are opportunities for us to think about education holistically, more than what do you do in the classroom, or what are the credentials that you earn, but what are the experiences that you've had, and what are the relationships that you've built? That's also an important part of an educational experience. And if we can help students find opportunities beyond the classroom, off campus, working with the business community, getting to know employers, getting to understand the opportunities that are available in Vermont, then the students themselves start to envision a possible pathway that is to stay here. There's also, on a statewide level, a new pilot program to support students in terms of loan repayment. So if they stay after graduation, and work for a Vermont based business for, I think it's 2 years. I'll have to check on the details, but this is a brand new program. Then there will be loan forgiveness. I think it's 5,000. I'm not sure. Again, I'd have to check on the details. But this is, again, a new approach to help make it more viable for our young people to stay. Now, there's also the housing piece of it too, which is quite a challenge for younger workers. Again, when they take a look at how much they're making versus how much they have to pay, if it doesn't add up, then it's hard for them to stay, even if they really, really want to. And I think that's the piece that I really want to focus on, is if there are people that want to stay here and want to work in Vermont and want to contribute meaningfully to our communities, we should be finding ways to make it possible.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I've just went through it after graduating college, a couple years ago. It's so expensive to, I would have liked to stay where my college was, but it's just so expensive to start off at a brand new job and then live there all alone. It's so many more people, at least in my friend group, at least, are going back home because it's just so expensive to try to get that initial start. So being able to get that collaboration with the community to keep the students there and be able to kind of welcome them into Vermont, especially if they enjoyed it.
Yeah, the second part of your question about the number of children in Vermont. So we've seen birth rates decline steadily over the years. So how do you change population? There's sort of two ways: natural increases or decrease. So that's the balance of births versus deaths. And as our birth rate has decreased, I've also mentioned that our population is rapidly aging. So if you look at that balance, it means that we really need to rely on a second bucket, which is in and out migration. That's the other way a population can change. And we've seen sort of on a federal level that migration numbers have declined quite a bit since 2016. So there are external factors outside of the control of Vermont that has impacted migration numbers. Hopefully we find ways to bump that number back up, because I think that's a better way to address the short-term workforce needs. Whereas, we can try to encourage families to have more kids. We obviously can't force people to do that. But even if the birth rate went up, there'd be a lag before contributions to the workforce. We can't just put a baby into a factory.
Yeah. Absolutely. For your state, I know we were talking about it before we started this. You have ski areas, you have a lot of hospitality. Do you notice an influx with those seasons from outside state workers coming in specifically for, the winter season, the summer season, anything like that? Or is it typically throughout your state that those workers are seasonal?
Yeah, I also apologize if there's some background noise. I live next to the airport, and
No worries.
F-35s getting ready to take off. So the Vermont does have seasonality to its economy. You mentioned the tourism and recreation industry as heavily reliant on a seasonal workforce during winter months. There's also agriculture as a very seasonal industry, right? So Vermont, just given those conditions, will always have to rely on some seasonality to who's here and when and what they're doing. Again, there are some federal programs in place for workers to come to Vermont, to come to the U.S. And participate in these work opportunities on short-term visas. But again, those numbers have dropped since 2016 because of policies outside of our control. I won't get into the details there. I think the sort of longer term question is, if these folks are already coming to the state and participating in part of the part of the year in our economy, are there ways for them to sort of embed themselves on a longer term and think about the full year economic cycle, right? The business cycle, and perhaps they are contributing to one industry in one part of the year and then shifting to work in a different industry as the seasons change. I think that'd be an interesting conversation to have.
Absolutely. It just sounds like the main theme and what we need to do to keep people in Vermont, whether it be Vermonters or outside people, is really create that community and that ability for them to connect from their job to living to, inviting them in and creating those programs to make that possible.
Yeah. There's a really tangible piece. I mentioned housing earlier. I think if I could point out one thing and say that will have sort of the largest impact on the viability for increasing the number of people that want to live in Vermont, and also to make it a bit more affordable for people who are already here too, right? We have to strike that balance. Increasing housing stock across the board would have very positive effects for our workforce, not only in the short term, but also in the long term as well. So if we look at, again, the demographic data and this aging population, there's also another number that I'd point at as a predictable sort of outcome with an aging population, is that household size has gone down. Mm-hmm. So if you think about like a family of four, hypothetical situation, 2 parents, 2 kids, and 20 years ago, they purchased a house that was the right size for that family of 4. Fast forward 20 years and maybe the kids have moved out, and now the parents, the 2 people, are occupying a home that was meant for 4 people. And those 2 kids now are looking for housing in the local market. Now there's more demand than there is supply. So as household size has gone down, that has also put pressure on our housing market. And Vermont is underbuilt for many, many decades. So the demand versus supply equation is really out of balance right now. And that's contributing heavily to the cost of living equation that I've mentioned a few times, and has made it really hard for people in both the ownership and the rental markets when it comes to housing.
That is, yeah, the cost of living is probably something that we'll hear over and over again, because it is really a huge point when we're looking at, getting people into our state and keeping them here. Mm-hmm. You have really done an excellent job covering all the things that I came in here with questions for, and all the questions that I was looking to get filled. Is there anything that we didn't talk about that you really wanted to connect and hit on before I wrap this up?
Yeah, I'll end with one more thing. Is that we've talked about some data sort of on the tangible side, right? Like housing, building houses, we can count how many permits are issued, and we can sort of see that physical transformation of our community if we go down that path. But I think we also need to talk about the transformation that has to happen in terms of how people think and feel and attitudes within the community as well. That's a really important part of evolution. And the Vermont Futures Project, we participated in something called the Vermonter Poll. So the University of Vermont, they run this survey each year, and they survey a representative sample of Vermonters to get an idea of what they're thinking, how they're feeling on a variety of topics. The Futures Project sponsored a question, which was, are you supportive of growing Vermont's population to address the workforce issues? 49% of respondents said yes, they would be supportive. 38% said no, and about 13% were unsure, right? So that to me represents one of our challenges or opportunities, right? So that 13% that are unsure, we need to engage with them and ask, why are you unsure? What are the factors? Is there data that might shape your thinking? So that's an opportunity for the Futures Project to carry out our mission through education. When we look at the age breakdown of that data, something really interesting emerged. So I went in with the assumption that perhaps younger people are more open to the idea of new Vermonters coming in, increasing the diversity in the state. And we look at the numbers and it's the exact opposite. So
Wow.
yeah, younger people in the respondent pool were more opposed to growing the population. And as the respondents got older through that survey, they became more open to the idea. What does that mean? We're still trying to dig into that to understand why that might be the case. Perhaps it is the housing piece, right? Younger Vermonters will feel more competition in the housing market by growing population, whereas someone who's already, if they already own a home, they're a little bit insulated from those fluctuations in the housing market. So that could be contributing to it. But there's also sort of I'll call them cultural narratives or sometimes even myths that get perpetuated, such as who gets to call themselves a Vermonter.
Yeah.
Right. And there are a variety of definitions, some of them stricter than others. And what does that do to create the conditions for people to feel welcome? If you're told that you'll never be able to call yourself a Vermonter and your family needs to be here for X number of generations, then you walk around feeling like an outsider. Right. I mentioned that I'm the son of immigrant parents. I walk around and proudly call myself a Vermonter just to help shift that narrative towards a more inclusive definition. And again, that's a less tangible thing. We can't sort of go out and measure how people feel about who gets to or what the right definition is of who is a Vermonter. But that in and of itself has an impact on where we go as a state in the future.
Absolutely. You guys have such an excellent community as Vermonters and such a strong excitement over your state and such a pride for it. But you're right, it can be very exclusive if certain people are looking at it different ways. You have to have lived here your whole life to be a Vermonter. You have to be here for a certain amount of time. So changing that attitude for people. How can we go out and help change that attitude, help get people to, continue to invite people in and kind of be the change?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So data is one way that I find to be effective to bring people together from different perspectives, right? What are the numbers? And then let's have a conversation about it. I think some truth can get revealed by starting a conversation around the data. Then also just thinking about the human relationships and impact that businesses can have, right? I think for businesses to think, what is our role within our community? We don't exist in sort of in isolation from the community, but we exist as part of a community. So what are the things we're doing beyond our day-to-day to create those open, inclusive, welcoming environments? I also think that with the data on race and ethnicity, I mentioned Vermont is the second oldest state. We're also the second whitest state too. And as we look at sort of the changing demographics of the nation around us and the world around us, from a business sense, it's in our best interest to diversify our workforce because that is the workforce of the future. And if we're not creating the conditions within our community to transform, to evolve who gets to participate, then we won't be able to attract the workforce of the future. It also means that the perspectives that are needed to operate a successful business in a changing world aren't going to be represented at the table if they're not here. So Vermont is about 92% white. So if we take a look at the 8% BIPOC community, what does that mean in terms of an absolute number? It's about 50 to 60,000 BIPOC Vermonters. So let's say, for example, Vermont creates a goal to double the number of BIPOC Vermonters. Well, that would mean increasing our population from about 645,000 to only about 700,000. That's not a wild number, and I know we have the capacity to do that. Um, what's the population of Boston? More than the entire state of
Oh,
Vermont.
yeah.
Yeah. So if we doubled the number of BIPOC Vermonters, we would still only be at about 85% white versus 15% BIPOC. And the national averages, we're getting close to about, it's about 60% white in terms of the national statistics.
Yeah.
So we can double the number of BIPOC Vermonters and still be pretty far off of the national average. So that's what I mean. It's imperative for us to be aware of this data and factor it into how we want to evolve as local communities on a state level. So then Vermont continues to be competitive in the future and seen as a place, back to what I said at the very beginning, I want Vermont to be seen as a place of opportunity, regardless of where people come from, what their background is. And that's why I do the work I do.
Absolutely. And it's great work to do. If people have follow-up questions or want to check out your website, where can they find that?
Yeah, the best way to check out our work is on our website, which is vtfuturesproject.org. And then you can get in touch with me directly at kchu@vtfuturesproject.org.
Thank you so much. Your time and expertise is so greatly appreciated. I know I have learned an exponential amount, and I cannot wait to go back onto your website and look at some of that data further. And a huge thank you to our audience and their questions for being with us today and keeping this conversation going about the Vermont workforce. One more reminder is BBB has another webinar coming up next month called BBB and SBA Programs and Services Overview. You can register through bbb.org on our events page for any of our upcoming events. This webinar was recorded and will be available on our Vimeo and YouTube found on bbb.org. Thank you so much for your time today, and I really appreciate you being able to hop on and kind of giving us that insight into Vermont and what the workforce looks like.
Thanks, Danielle. And that was a good reminder for me to also mention, follow us on LinkedIn.
Excellent.
And just a big thank you to you for moderating and the work that you're doing with the Better Business Bureau. Much appreciated.
Absolutely. We're happy to, and we're happy to be a resource just like you. If anybody needs to find us, you can find us on bbb.org, and you can find your local office to connect with. Thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.